in the spirit of worship and liturgy as the church has shaped and formed it, that we move from Easter in the experience of Jesus' resurrection. But because that's difficult to understand, the liturgy and the scripture gives us at least a couple of Sundays to try to have that whole experience of resurrection settle in for us. But it did it in such a way that, remember, we went from the empty tomb where there's no physical evidence of resurrection to then Jesus going through an open, closed door and through the walls as if, what is he, a ghost, or is resurrection about that? And then finally to him having breakfast on the lakeshore. So that resurrection becomes a real thing, a physical thing, if you will, a transformative reality. Remember, even Mary Magdalene couldn't recognize him after resurrection. We had that discussion for a few Sundays after Easter, and then we moved to say, well, what is this resurrected Lord about? What does it mean to say that Jesus is the resurrected one? We had one Sunday where it was described, well, he is the good shepherd, the one that leads us and recognizes and knows our names. And another form, Jesus is the vine and we are the branches. To talk about resurrection means not just about Jesus anymore, but about the way that when we attach ourselves to Jesus, and of course the Christian ritual for that is baptism, that when we are baptized, we are joined to his life, his death, and his resurrection. So that now, if we are the sheep and are the branches, then something about the way we are in the world is to reflect what resurrection, what transformation means. I think one of the bad parts of Christian tradition and history and theology is that resurrection is something to come way out there, somewhere out in the future, at the end of time. When really, in the early church, it was about now. That when we are joined to Christ in baptism, we are already resurrected. And so that has meant that as the lectionary moves this Sunday, next Sunday, leading to Pentecost, that we begin to ask the question, well, how do we do that? What really motivates us, what really moves us to live resurrected lives? What's the outcome of that? What's the implication of that? And here, in the reading of the book of Revelation, the implication is clear that it's a new world, a new way of life, a new way of being in the world, a new way of being in relationship with others. The new and eternal Jerusalem, something that never ends. And again, we push it off to the future, but in the early church it was understood to be something now. That the church, that we become the new and eternal Jerusalem. Meaning that there's a responsibility and an obligation we have as resurrected people joined to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection in baptism, that there's an obligation and responsibility we have in the world. Not just in terms of faith and thinking about salvation in terms of the future, but an obligation and a responsibility to begin to transform and change this world in which we live so that it reflects not just the glory of God, but reflects the transformation and change that has happened as a result of resurrection. And so I found it interesting as I listened to it this morning, the contrast is intended to be sharp for us. And while I'm not always comfortable in thinking of black and white terms, or either or we against they, that you can imagine that in the first century, out of which this book of Revelation arises, that in the first century, people found themselves kind of caught in the middle. And in being caught in the middle, they had to either say that my allegiance is with the new Jerusalem, with this new vision, with the resurrected Christ, or my allegiance is with everything that I've already been participating and living in the world. So that I have to either give, and remember, even in the gospel story of Jesus, is my allegiance to Caesar or is my allegiance to God? And that one text suggests, well, you can have it both ways. Well, by the time of the book of Revelation, you can't have it both ways. You can't have your foot on one side of the fence and say, wow, look at all this green grass, how wonderful this is. Oh, around here, oh wow, look at this green grass. And pretty soon, you know, you begin to, and what happens is that as you try to straddle both worlds, it becomes impossible because then you know what happens? We settle for mediocrity. Remember in the movie Amadeus? I just thought that was one of the great parts of the movie Amadeus. Mediocrity. Everybody settles for what's the least common denominator. Because when we settle for what's the least common denominator, we are all going to get along then, aren't we? Well, now wait a minute. You see what happens is that if that's the point where I'm trying to straddle both, living in the world of Caesar and living in the New Jerusalem, thinking that they are opposites, which they are, and I settle for what's least stressful, what's least demanding, what's least, you know, I say that sometimes to my students. They go, so you're requiring me to do all of this work? And I say, yes. And remember, I teach classes for nurses, and I say, because I hope to God that if you're my nurse, you're not just going to settle for the least amount of work that you have to do as a nurse. Can you imagine that? Well, no, you got to do your best all the time. You got to be at the peak of your gifts all the time. And you see, that's what we struggle with. Because if we're going to settle for mediocrity or trying to balance two, usually what happens is that the world of Caesar is way more appealing. It is. You know how it's way more appealing? Because when you think that one of the center points of the Christian gospel is, we're going to have to suffer and die on the cross with Jesus. Who wants that for a way of life? When what the world of Caesar promises is, just sell your soul, sort of like Faust. Sell your soul to the highest bidder, and you will live in luxury and prosperity. Every time one of us goes to the casino or buys a lottery ticket, we say, here's our ticket out of this mess. Right? But the world of the New Jerusalem says, that ticket is for the transformation of that mess, not for the creation of more, but for the transformation of what is. So that reading, it's very interesting if you hear it in the context of the first century, when the Christians, much like we are today, I really do think there's not that much that separates us over 2,000 years. It's interesting. It says, no, and I want you to hear this very specifically, because there are still many Christians who are saying that those that get into heaven are going to be few. Only the pure, only the holy. Usually that kind of means only the white and only the straight are going to get in. That anybody who's different from that norm just can't possibly make it in. But look how it says. There's no temple, meaning that we're not committed to a building, to a structure, to the institution that goes along with that. The city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, because God's glory is shown. And notice what it says. There's no gates. You know what that means? In the first century, almost every city was walled. And you built a wall for the purpose of defenses, to keep the riffraff out, to keep the enemy out. And so at night, they would go through the cities. That's like the beginning of the town crier. And the town crier would ring a bell, go through the city. All you dirty and unclean and poor and disgusting, smelly people, out! And they literally would push the people who seemingly didn't belong inside, outside, and then slam the door on them. You stay out, because you can contaminate us and disrupt us. It's no surprising that in Western Europe, that when the Jews were perceived as a threat, that they were restricted to a ghetto. And you know what happened? I don't know if you saw it when you went to Prague or if you've been to Venice. That they would force all the Jews back into their square mile of the city and slam the door on them. You stay in your part and don't contaminate the rest of us. That's how Caesar works. Slam the door, build the walls, enact more laws to prevent the riffraff from contaminating us. That's how Caesar talks. But you see what it looks like in the New Jerusalem? There are no gates. Meaning, the New Jerusalem is always open to whoever wants to come in. Because outside the walls, there's no healing. Only inside is the healing. Only inside will the benefits be understood and experienced. Meaning that inside this New Jerusalem, God offers grace not just to the clean, but also to the unclean. God offers healing and life and hope to the dirty and disgusting and smelly people that we want to keep out, to the ones who don't have maybe the right papers or the right kind of card. The New Jerusalem is open to everyone. We heard this just a couple of weeks ago or last week when it said, I heard the number of those who were saved, 144,000, and some in Christianity want to limit it to just that number. But it went on to say, from every race, every nation, everywhere, they're all a part of the reign of God, all a part of this New Jerusalem. Now you see, the implication of that has to be clear to us. That as church, that the more we're tempted to buy it. I just saw Liberty University, who's supposed to be a Christian university, has just begun a policy of allowing its students to carry unconcealed weapons in the dorms. What is that about? It makes no sense. I guess if we live in a world of Caesar that promotes gun violence based upon more fear, right? Every time there's an act of gun violence, gun sales go up. Well, no wonder gun violence goes up, because everybody's got a gun. Even churches in Texas are now allowed to carry guns inside the church. My God, with some of my sermons, I would be dead already by now. How scary is that? You see how subtle and how easy Caesar draws us into his world instead of in the New Jerusalem. And if you read through that, it's very clear. It says, nothing unclean will enter, no one who practices abomination or falsehood. Now you could read that one way, and fundamentalist Christians do. But I want to read it this way, that in the New Jerusalem, anyone who preaches hate or promotes violence or enacts any kind of law of discrimination, that's an abomination in the face of God. Because if God is about love and reconciliation and hope, then in the New Jerusalem, we cannot be agents of hate or prejudice or violence against anyone. Every time someone straps a bomb to their body and blows themselves up in the name of Allah or God or Yahweh or whoever, every time somebody does that, that's an abomination and a blasphemy. Because God doesn't want us blowing ourselves and others up for some imagined future. You see, the contrasts need to be drawn sharply, so we're not tempted to compromise the values of inclusion and healing and hope. We can't compromise those values. just so it sits well with Caesar. We can't do that. And most especially as church, we can't do that. And if we want to belong to church, we can't do that. And it doesn't work that we can sit here in church and be so holy and so pious and walk out of this building and fall right into the world of Caesar. That's not how it works. Maybe that's why the world isn't being transformed, because we as Christians have compromised so much and given away so much. Why there are now 28% of the people in the United States who say they have no religious affiliation. Because what example do we give as church? If we continue to compromise so much to Caesar and look so much like Caesar, that if anybody who has a thought of peace or healing or reconciliation, they're not finding it in church. How sad that is, isn't it? That's why if you look at the gospel that Jesus, notice the refrain, catching back. Actually, this is a text before Easter, but if you remember liturgically on the night of Easter, which was the second Sunday that we had, Jesus comes into the room. Remember, it's locked because of fear. That's how Caesar wants us to be. Because Caesar can make great profit on our fear. And Jesus goes right through that wall of fear. And notice the first thing that he said. Remember? He didn't say any words of judgment. He said, peace. Peace I give you. And then he said on Easter, he breathed on them and gave them the Spirit. So if you look at this text, where we are liturgically is moving towards Pentecost. And so the readings begin to shift in that direction. And the word advocate that our text uses is a very technical word. It's in fact a word that Caesar uses. Because if you're a lawyer or have ever been into a courtroom, and let's say that you're too poor to pay for your own lawyer, that a court-appointed lawyer is provided for you. And in the ancient world, that person was called an advocate. Someone who would advocate for you when nobody else was going to stand up for you. Because you were poor and unclean and didn't have the right kind of connections and network of people, that a court-appointed advocate was given for you, so that when it came time to defend yourself and you had no clue at all how to defend yourself, the advocate would step in your place and speak the words that would be needed to set you free. So the Holy Spirit isn't just a white dove that's going to flutter around. The advocate is the reality of God that gives us the courage, the strength, the inspiration, the motivation to make sure that we stay committed to the New Jerusalem and not fall into the trap of Caesar. But even more, in the understanding of the Christian tradition, every single one of us needs to be an advocate for each other. That we would be willing to stand up, stand behind, and stand with each other. One more step. That each of us would be a powerful advocate. Like Mother Teresa for the untouchables in India, who were not going to get any help because they were untouchables. And she said, When someone is dying, you don't ask their social status or their religion. You care for them because they're dying. There it is. Every single one of us needs to be an advocate for the poor, the dirty, the lame, the unclean, judged by Caesar. We need to be advocates for the people who have no one to stand up for them in the world. Because then, the New Jerusalem has a chance to be established.